So we are still here with our friend Mark Wolynn and the book, It Didn't Start With You. And I am just so excited about this because it just explains so much of and I know everyone listening is having somewhat of this effect. I mean, people listen to us because they either want to be psychologically savvy or they have experienced trauma, depression, anxiety, all of those reasons.
They want a better brain.
They want to be better.
But your brain is influenced in so many ways by things that not only happen to you, but happen to your parents, to your grandparents. You even talk about it in the book. It could be uncles or cousins.
Well, and we were talking about how in the last episode, how it's passed down, how this trauma can be passed down. And that's just so fascinating to me. But also we're going to end up getting to things you can do. But it's really interesting. One thing I was talking to you about off air, if I can just bring it up really quickly, was so I didn't notice that I was passing this down to my daughter at one point because I had a very chaotic childhood and my mother had a more chaotic childhood and my grandmother had a very chaotic childhood, but I didn't know all that. I wasn't paying attention to all of that. I'm not aware of it at this point. And she was pretty young and I put her in martial arts when she was really young. And I'm like, dance is optional. Learning how to fight is not. And that was just I was not kidding about it. And so she ended up being resistant to it because I was so adamant about it and learning how to use your voice and, all of those things. And I'm pretty intense. And so she came to me one day and she goes, "Mom, I love you." She was 11, maybe 12. And she says, "Mom, I love you so much." And she's like, "I'm so sorry for what you went through. But I don't want to grow up being scared. I don't want to go through life being scared. I live in Newport Beach." She's like, I just don't want to be. She's like, "You make me anxious." So she was aware enough to, and I literally I had to step back and check myself. I prided myself on being a good mother. And here I was passing it down to her, not by doing the same things that were done to me as a child, but in another way, by making her think it's not safe. She has to, always look over her shoulder and fight and, It was interesting that she caught it.
And from the story you told me about your grandmother, the way I would look at that is her stress response to having all these traumas as a little 5-year-old. Yeah. This is heritable. That's when we look at how trauma is passed from a parent to a child. Let's say something happens, a trauma happens, then there's this chemical change in our DNA. And this changes how our genes function, sometimes for generations. Technically, a chemical tag will attach to the DNA and tell the cell to use or ignore certain genes based on this trauma that just happened. And so we can be better equipped to deal with this trauma. And then the way our genes are affected, this changes how we act or feel. For example, we could become sensitive or reactive to situations that are similar to this trauma, even if this trauma occurred in a past generation. Wow. For example, if our grandparents, like your grandmother, comes from this war-torn country, so there's people being lost, people being killed, people being separated, people, you said, I still can't get over this trauma. 3 days at 5 years old, lost in the mountains by herself. So as a result of war trauma, our grandparents would pass forward a skill set that they would adapt to help them survive what's going on. For example, sharper reflexes, quicker reaction times, reactions to the violence to help us survive the trauma.
Right. That makes sense.
They're the ones that experience us surviving the trauma they experience, because the problem is they're also passing forward this stress response with the dial set to 10. And here we are waiting for this catastrophe because we live in Newport Beach or wherever that never arrives.
Right. That's so fascinating. Yeah.
It was interesting that people's cortisol levels, because people think of cortisol as the stress response. It triggers the fight or flight response. But in survivors of trauma, the research shows that cortisol is low, not high.
Is it because it's worn out? Or is it just adapted?
Well, I'd love your thoughts on that. If you had any thoughts on why that would be.
We're kind of out of my knowledge base. I do know that what Rachel Yehuda talks about, the thinking, as you say, prior to this had been that it would be high levels of cortisol. Right. And she comes out with this data saying, no, it's actually, and for the listeners, that's the stress hormone that gets us back to normal again after a stressful event. And she's showing that the trauma survivors, she was working with the community of Holocaust survivors. And what she's noticing is that the children have the same trauma symptoms as their parents, right, specifically these low levels of cortisol. And she's also the one who found that there was a similar pattern in babies that were born to mothers who were at or near the World Trade Center when it was attacked during 9/11. And then when the mothers went on to develop PTSD, these babies went on to develop PTSD, but that wasn't all. They were smaller for their gestational age. They had 16 genes that expressed differently. In other words, these events are affecting us on multiple levels.
Wild. That's wild.
Well, and cortisol is a steroid, and we use steroids to tamp down inflammation, like if you're having an asthma attack or you have an infection. And so being unable to mount that response can leave people really vulnerable to, both mental health and medical issues. Another thing you talked about in the book was soldiers who had PTSD from Iraq and Afghanistan. 30% of their children also had PTSD. It's called secondary PTSD, which is the first time I'd heard about that. And I'm like, wow. So, just back to what you're saying, it didn't start with you. So what do we do about this? My grandfather, who grew up with this terrible tragedy to his brother, ended up holding a grudge for the rest of his life to his sister, who let his brother borrow the car, or to Tana's grandmother. And how do we help, like Chloe and our other children? How do we help them not inherit this and then pass it on? I'm just thinking about my grandson, Eli, who I adore, but, struggles with tics and anxiety and worry. And what's the solution? So there's the research right now. There's a lot of good news. We're not all doomed. We're not in
so good to know.
Thinking this, the researchers are able to reverse the trauma symptoms in mice. And so what's happening is that the reason we look at mice in the first place is they share with humans 92-93% of a similar genetic makeup. For every gene in a human, there's a counterpart in mice, and 80% of them are even identical. So they cause adversity to little mice. They look at the effects. They can see if the event happened in this generation to this mouse, they can see the behavioral effects in the following two generations to the pups and the grandpups without them having experienced the trauma directly. So now they're taking some of those. In other words, you brought up that the mice who smelled the cherry blossom scent. It deserves repeating. It's such a great study. They make mice fear this cherry blossom scent by shocking them every time they smell the event. And then they see right in that first generation of the poor little mice that are shocked, they can see there's already been physiologic adaptations. They had enlarged areas of their brain where there's a greater amount of smell receptors, so they can detect the scent at lesser concentrations, thereby protecting themselves. Well, it's not only there in the brain, there's changes in the blood, there's changes in the sperm. So the researchers had an idea. What do we do if we take some of the sperm and impregnate female mice that aren't shocked and separate the mice that were shocked so there's no learning, behavioral learning from the prior generation, and let's look at the pups and the grandpups. Well, when the pups and the grandpups just smelled the cherry blossom scent, they'd get jumpy and jittery and started freaking out. And they had never experienced the shock.
Wow.
So now, yeah, it's it's amazing. That's us. Our grandparents experienced the trauma, and here we are, or our parents, and here we are, and here are our children expressing the trauma in ways that can advance from a trigger. So we have a triggering event, an age, an event. I'll get to that in a minute. And but first, let me answer how we heal. So when you look at what they're doing with mice right now, it's like, whew. So even those mice that were shocked and made to fear the scent, what Brian Diaz, the researcher, did is he taught them not to fear it by repeatedly exposing them to it and not shocking them. And then these mice no longer had heightened sensitivity to the scent, and their sperm lost the fearful epigenetic signature that was able to pass to future generations. So just looking at the mice, they benefited from positive experiences. Well, that's how we heal.
That's wild. We
have got to calm the brain stress response, whether we've inherited it or the trauma happened to us. So, just to answer the question you asked me, what do? We do our own work, and we work with having positive experiences that feed the prefrontal cortex to get us out of the midbrain, of course, and practice the feelings, the energies, the sensations of what's positive, so the amygdala is not sending out alarm signals to the alarm tower saying, get out of your body, tighten your body. Instead, we have this experience of being in our body, calm, being in a state of compassion, mindfulness, gratitude, loving kindness, generosity, some state that feeds the prefrontal cortex.
Oh, so
peace, love, joy, trust.
So I call it positivity bias training.
Yeah.
We actually do a study on a test on all of our patients called Web Neuro, and one of the 17 tests is, do you tend to go more toward the positive or the negative? And we very often see these very high negative scores, which then leads us to go. And so positivity training, loving kindness meditation, start the day with today is going to be a great day. And then your brain finds why. And when you finish the day, what went well today, so that you're beginning to retrain your brain. So
when you were talking about this cherry blossom study, it made me think of a question, because we all, when we come out of traumatic, well, not all of us, some of us go down a whole different path, and some people start doing drugs or whatever. But many of us want to be better. And so we think to ourselves, I'm going to do better than my parents did.
The drug addicts want to be better. They just don't know.
They just don't know how. Right. Yeah. So we think to ourselves, I'm going to be a better parent. I'm going to be a better whatever wife, whatever husband, whatever it is. Okay. So I'm going to do better than my parents did. But yet, without even realizing it, they're repeating the pattern, right, that their parents did. Now, is that why? Is it because, it just brought up that question for me, like, oh, maybe they can't even help it. Maybe it's just like sort of ingrained in their DNA. They're really trying to do better, but it just keeps repeating.
Because they have no idea what's going on. I'll let you, when we come back, Mark, we'll start with that question and so more on, I want everybody thinking about, well, are there things you inherited from a family trauma? But my guess is, and I think you alluded to this, is people also inherit strengths. And so it's not all bad news. Because, if I think of your mother, right, or your grandmother who's really a survivor.
My mom's a badass, yeah.
We inherit all of this. Stay with us.
If you're enjoying the Brain Warriors Way podcast, please don't forget to subscribe so you'll always know when there's a new episode. And while you're at it, feel free to give us a review or 5-star rating, as that helps others find the podcast.
If you're considering coming to Amen Clinics or trying some of the brain healthy supplements from BrainMD, you can use the code podcast10 to get a 10% discount on a full evaluation at amenclinics.com or a 10% discount on all supplements at brainmdhealth.com. For more information, give us a call at 855-978-1363.